back to the Security on Happy Hour, where we bring together a group of security professionals and naturally cheery folks to discuss topics in the cybersecurity community, share knowledge, learn, teach, and exchange ideas. Before we get started, it's important to point out that the views and opinions expressed on the Security on Happy Hour and related websites are those of the hosts, guests, and authors, and do not necessarily reflect the official policy or position of any one company. In this episode, Lisa Bradley, Katie Noble, Crob, and I are going to talk about embargoes of security vulnerabilities and all that entails. Let's start this off, Katie. Maybe you could talk to us about what it means when there is an embargo on a security vulnerability.
It means no talkie.
No talkie.
So that's the
no touching.
Yeah, absolutely. But I believe they said no. Don't hand me no lines and keep your hands to yourself, I think is the phrase there. No, so it basically means that both parties or all parties have come to an agreement that no one will publicly say anything to anybody who is outside of the circle of trust until such time as that embargo ends. So we used to call it, an old cowboy, standoff. Basically, everybody just kind of gets in their positions, and then we all hold guns on each other until we're all ready to go. And then nobody moves until everyone moves. And then it all kind of happens very quickly in unison, usually several minutes apart. So when a researcher or a vendor would release their security advisory, a CVE would be published, and the researcher would release their security advisory all within minutes of each other. And so that's how that happens. That is what an embargo is. Does anyone else have any other?
Why do companies do that, though?
Because
why is that a practice in the industry? It's not just companies that do that.
Yeah. So often that is done because the idea is that you are attempting to reduce adversarial advantage, right? So there is a significant issue. It needs to be fixed. All parties that, the researcher, the vendor, any coordinator in the middle, whoever, all know that it's serious. They're all taking it very seriously. And the worst thing that could happen is somebody finds out about that, then creates an exploit, and a user on the end of the line is not protected. So the idea is that if information is kept in an embargo status, it's a controlled status, and it allows information to be shared between parties as it needs to be shared, but you reduce adversarial advantage because there's less chance that an adversary will uncover that information and create an exploit, and then ultimately exploit a customer at the end of the line. That's the ultimate sort of terminus of that sort of adventure that you don't want to happen.
Is that the whole protection then, that you're trying to just stop it from being leaked?
Yeah, and you don't want it to go.
Crob's not.
So yes and no. You don't want information to. Embargoes are not meant to last forever. It's not burying the situation or hiding anything. What it is attempting to do the most good during that time period, right? It gives the parties that are involved the ability to actually fix the problem rather than having to go and answer and do a whole bunch of unnecessary cycles trying to explain to everybody and their brother, well, what does this mean? How does this impact me? Oh my gosh, does it impact me? I don't know. And then during that time, all of that takes a lot of churn. And so what it does is it allows the owner operators to be able to assess the issue, triage it, develop a mitigation, deploy that mitigation without having to worry unnecessarily that the information is going to be breached to a party that would take advantage of that information and cause harm.
I look at it from three perspectives. First and foremost, if it's a security researcher, there's very potentially they found some new novel thing. So no one else knows about it, not even the researcher. They might have stumbled across it. So that embargo time allows the researcher time to continue testing their hypothesis. And normally you'll get engagement with the owner of that particular thing, hardware, software. From the owner's perspective, if it's a company, you have a set product schedule. You have deadlines, you've made commitments to your customers. Some new report, you can't necessarily drop everything and react to and spit something out on a dime. So it also takes you time to do the assessment, to validate with that researcher that that finding is accurate, because sometimes they're not. Sometimes the researcher doesn't have as much knowledge as a company, and they find something that's interesting but isn't necessarily a problem. And then that third perspective, thinking about it from the operators, the actual end users, they don't want to be told about a problem A they can't fix or do anything about, and B, they have a similar problem to the vendors that they also have production systems they have to keep up. They have commitments to maintenance schedules, so they can't ingest that. So the embargo helps kind of all three of those types of constituents.
So Crob, since you brought up researchers, I'm curious.
I love researchers; they're the best.
Yeah, no. How do you all feel? Like, how do you think that researchers feel about the embargoes? Are they happy they exist, or does it complicate things? Like, I'm curious.
It depends from my perspective. What type of researcher are you talking to? Are you talking to a professional bug bounty hunter? Well, they want to get paid, so they want validation as quickly as possible so they can get a paycheck. Is it an academic? You know, they have a different set of motivations. They might have a different time schedule. Is it like is it a OEM kind of a partner relationship? Well, that motivation and time scale is different. They want the thing fixed, so they have the minimum amount of extra work to do. So I get really, from my perspective, depends.
Yeah,
Some
no.
like it, some don't.
Yeah.
What do you think, Josh?
No, I was just going to add to that, right? I think you're right, Crob. I think some do, some don't, but I think a lot of them see it as a potential hurdle or obstacle that they have to deal with when they're engaging with a vendor. It can almost seem stifling for some. And we see that from time to time, right? Some researchers feel like, well, we're going to control their ability to disclose. In reality, we can't, and we don't, right? Our goal is to partner with them on that disclosure strategy. So we're protecting the ecosystem in the process. It's
Yeah,
But
but a lot of
also-
researchers
But that's
have been
thinking it's-
burned as well, and so they have had bad experiences where in the olden days, before the Enlightenment,
Like when Josh started out.
I don't comment on that. But in the olden days, you know, the researcher vendor relationship wasn't always positive, and there have been some organizations who their goal was to hide it and to never let things go out of embargo, and to say, oh, that researcher's being irresponsible, and they're being, you know, a terrible partner because they're going to go talk about this vulnerability. But in reality, you know, 2 or 3 years down the line, and I mean, so there have been bad experiences. So, and I do find it interesting that not all researchers have a problem, especially the academics, because they have there's some potential for you to 0-day an academic, which is a very weird place to be in. When we know the information as the vendor, but they've got a conference that they want to go to, and if you have the ability to spill the information and mess up their conference, they want to be the first to disclose, right? So there is that trust relationship. So it does go both ways.
So in essence, in that situation, if there's a conference for a researcher, the researcher is the one who's actually more setting the embargo than the company that's affected, potentially, because they want to make sure that you don't pre-disclose before the conference, because that's their big shining moment, which I want to give to them. I totally get. Right?
Vulnerability disclosure to me is a mutually beneficial relationship.
right.
Yeah.
Vendor benefits just as much as the finder.
Yeah.
Right. So when we talk about the conferences, besides setting the embargo, like I guess sometimes what I struggle with is that you work with a researcher on something, you set the embargo date, and then all of a sudden they realize they want to go and submit it to a conference, and you are aiming for one date, and you've already told maybe your OEM partners because you were allowed to, because that's the acceptance that you worked with the researcher on, and then you're all heading towards that, and then they're like, oh wait, no, we got to accept to this conference and we want you to push this off for a month, and you're like, usually more time sounds great, but sometimes it's difficult, right?
I mean, it can be, I guess, but I mean, I tend to like more time. So if it,
What if
it's
it then ups the time though? What if all of a sudden their conference is sooner than what their original embargo date is? And that's like a whole other story. Because they're like, we're obviously going to disclose this at a conference, and you thought you had one more month and now you don't.
I mean, I guess
You know
that
how
goes
long
back
build
to,
schedules could be, right? I mean,
sure, but I guess that goes back to being a, trusted partner in the relationship and working out the differences. Like I don't know. I can see things from both perspectives. And so I think that you have to just work together on that. Like,
but how do you work together when if the date changes,
I-
right, because of a conference, and all of a sudden now you have the fix available, right? Then
they
you're in
own the
essence
information at the end of
you're
the day.
getting
If they
zero
want to
days
disclose
though.
it, yeah, but at the end of the day, if they want to disclose it, they're going to
Oh,
disclose it.
I totally get it. I'm just talking about the complications that could happen, right?
Yeah, and that's why PCERTs exist, so that there is all of those mitigations in
Risk
place,
mitigation.
and those kind of milestones and facilitating factors in place to help you manage that risk as a vendor. That's why PCERTs exist. So it's
And
I
that's why
know.
not
having
always going to go
clear
smoothly.
expectations up front, though, helps.
Yeah.
It's not going
Right,
to
but I'm
fix the
saying you have
problem,
the
but it's
clear
going to help saying we
expectations.
all agreed this is what we're working towards. And if something happens, something's going to happen. But having those expectations, saying I'm going to present this at a conference or I'm not, is kind of important information for everyone in that
And sometimes,
relationship to work through.
yeah, sometimes it's about, not just setting expectations, but helping the researchers understand, because there are times when this is new to them. And, we have to spend time with them to help them understand how this works and what our perspective is. And that way they can form their own direction and ideas, right?
It definitely
So-
ruins my weekend when they want to go disclose early.
That's what I'm saying. Like, I mean, I get it, right? I get
They
it.
always
It's
tell
just,
you on a Friday at like 2 p.m, and you're like,
yeah. That's what I was sort of getting at. It's like I totally am excited for them. Go for you getting to the conference. That's great. Then I'm like, oh my gosh, we're not going to be ready now though, because like our build cycle might take a while for some of our product lines, so it's
I mean,
hard.
but we've worked with a couple of researchers who have done that kind of thing in the past, and we kind of worked with them on a couple of parameters for their presentations as well. And we've said
Right.
like, hey, you can talk about some things, but don't talk about these things. And
Or yeah, please don't publish your proof of concept code right now because
Yeah.
we don't have it addressed yet. Yeah, no, I agree with that. I think a lot of researchers are a lot more willing to understand that. And lately, even Google Project Zero did that 90 plus 30 thing where they give an extra 30 days to do before they post the proof of concept code. So if researchers take advantage of that or not take advantage of it, but follow that same type of logic, it's helpful.
yeah, Josh, you were going to say something?
No, I was going to say, this sort of dovetails into a question I had for you, Katie, about do conferences create embargo challenges?
Yeah, they do.
And what kind of challenges do they create?
Well, so timing challenges specifically. So you always get, so on the vendor side, we always see a huge uptick in disclosures right before Black Hat. And so it tends to come out, and they always tend to be about 45 days before Black Hat or 45 days before RSA, which tends to be right before Christmas. So there are a couple, I guess, widely accepted policies that are misconstrued and taken out of context. So you mentioned Google Project Zero, who has a 90-day policy. They've adjusted that a little bit, but not all vulnerabilities have easy fixes that can be implemented in 7 to 14 days. Some of them take a lot longer, and some of them are, safety critical systems like airplanes or nuclear power plants. And so those things you have to test and retest and mitigate and certify, like election systems, you have to recertify, medical devices, you have to recertify. So sometimes those things can take a lot longer, but
yeah, the FIP certification, right? That takes a long time.
Yeah.
Yep.
So a lot of times we'll see disclosures, or rather vulnerabilities, be submitted right before a conference, usually about 45 to 90 days before a conference. So they tend to happen around April and around November, October, right? And so the big ones they're hitting there are DEF CON and RSA. Also IEEE happens in May, and IEEE just changed their standard. So they now have a policy, their ethics policy says that the researcher only has to wait 45 days in order to be considered having gone through coordinated vulnerability disclosure. And they take that straight from the CERT Coordination Center. So the CERT Coordination Center, CERT CC, they have a policy, and their policy is very widely taken out of context. And I will say that as one of those people who worked there. Yeah, very widely taken out of context. I mean, I worked on that team for a long time, and that policy, the 45 days, is a response policy. It's the vendor has 45 days to respond to CERT. It's not the whole process has to be done in 45 days. It's the vendor can't go silent. And that is because there have been, like we said in the beginning, some situations where not everybody is upholding ethical standards and not everybody is doing the right thing. And that was in the before times. So a lot of people are on board with coordinated vulnerability disclosure. A lot of people are on board with the new thought process that researchers are not bad, and that we have to work cooperatively if we're gonna secure the ecosystem. So conferences do present a lot of challenges, and the challenges often come in timing. And then you have some researchers who just don't bother at all, and they will go get a conference, go get their speaking slot done, and then they'll drop a 0 day right on the DEF CON stage, and that is a nightmare.
I find it interesting, though. I think it's nice that conferences are trying to put some kind of rules around, even if it's not the rule of engagement we might all want. But I have gotten 0 dayed at a conference, and it would have been nice for that conference to pay a little bit more attention to say, hey, did you even talk to that vendor yet about this? Because you're about to 0 day them. Like,
Yeah,
and asking that question. Like, so I think some conferences that do, like, kudos to you.
Yeah, but it's not the conference's responsibility to go contact
I know
every
it's
single
not,
vendor
but it's
and say,
certainly
"Did you
nice.
know about this? Did you know about that? Did you know about this?" It is certainly nice. I agree.
Certainly nice that they push on it.
But yeah, absolutely. But it really is the researcher. I think sometimes researchers don't understand quite the impact of what they have, and they put a lot of time and effort into it, and it's no small thing to do security research. But at the same time, consider the wider ecosystem, right? Consider what you have found and how that could be used to harm people. And we're not talking about the world of the cyber world and the real world anymore. Like, there's only one world, and the colonial pipeline situation just proved it. How many times do we have to have an industrial control system hack before people realize the impacts of these malicious actors on infrastructure, right? So oftentimes I think researchers don't quite understand fully what they have, right? And so they don't know how serious to take, because it's just kind of a cool thing that they found, right? And it's super sexy and super entertaining, but that can be used to cause real harm. And so I will push it back onto the researchers and say there is a duty to disclose in a reasonable fashion. I think first, the Forum of Incident Response and Security Teams now has an ethics SIG, so special interest group that talks about ethics and security research. And I would encourage people to go and look at that, because they've outlined some pretty good standards and guidelines for ethical behavior when you're conducting security research and incident response.
It's also, there's a responsibility to the entity that was reported to be a good partner. And if there is circumstances that are beyond, the researcher didn't discover X or Y, it's incumbent upon that partnership to help, maybe not tell everything, but help coach and make sure that the disclosure is appropriate and there isn't, fear, uncertainty, and doubt, and that things are measured, and it collaborating with your partners, that somebody that takes time to research something, they think your product is important enough to look into and spend time researching, give them the appropriate equal amount of attention as well. So you give them the respect to be responsive and kind of help share in that research and that embargo, that collaboration.
I was just thinking about conferences when what we were talking about conferences responsibility in this, and I think the only thing that conferences can really do is help to encourage the process of coordinated disclosure and embargoes and maintaining it. Now, there's two parts to that before I let you have the floor there, Crob. One part is when a vulnerability is reported to a vendor and then submitted to a conference, there is another layer to the embargo, right? Normally the embargo might be between the researcher and a vendor, and now you have the conference that doesn't necessarily want to break or breach an embargo. I think my experience with most conferences is that they really want to do the right thing, but you have that complication that there are now many other people that are getting a chance to look at that vulnerability. And then the other element is, did the researcher reach out to the vendor? And it's a simple question for most conferences to ask. And if so, then they should be confident that that researcher is following some form of CBD or they're interacting with that vendor. And if they did, then the conference itself has to maintain the embargo along with all the parties involved. So
I was going to say, it's foolish for a PCERT only to rely on RSA, Black Hat, and DEF CON. There are hundreds of security conferences. So A, you're probably not looking in all the right places. B, conferences aren't the only places certain types of researchers announce their work. There's somebody might be going for their dissertation or their thesis. So they might have internally within the university, there might be some type of publication. There's different research magazines and whatnot. So there's a lot of different avenues. So a vendor that has products and services needs to be aware that there are potentially multiple avenues. Conferences are very sexy and exciting. Everyone loves to see, the GPAC happening live on stage. That's great. But there's other places that this stuff gets reported to the world.
Sounds like that's a good topic for a future talk for us.
Hacking Jeeps. I love Jeeps.
No, I meant, where can you find the issues, how to pay attention?
Oh, I thought you were talking about the parties at DEF CON and how I broke into the Microsoft party. I thought that was the good conversation, but go on.
That sounds like fun too. I'm going with you.
I wouldn't
next
know.
time.
I never got an invite.
I got an invite, but next time I'll sneak in. It's more fun. So when I think of embargoes, usually when I'm not thinking of researcher ones, but I'm more thinking of like my industry partners, I tend to start thinking, well, what does this embargo mean to me? Because I actually feel like there's different types of embargoes. Sometimes there's embargoes where you're not allowed to tell anyone, right? Sometimes you could tell people with a need to know in your company. Sometimes you could tell people with a need to know that you also have NDAs with. And then even to go further, there's angles of you can maybe you can address the issue publicly, but you can't disclose or talk about it publicly until a certain date. And then there's some embargoes where they're like, you can't disclose or fix it or anything until this date. So I oftentimes I look at it, and if I feel like I have any misunderstanding, I will ask my legal or ask the person who put the embargo on us to clarify it if I'm confused, because the last thing I want to do is to break an embargo. I really pride ourselves to not do that. It does happen sometimes more by human error. And in a big recent issue that I dealt with, a lot of the times with the embargo, I needed to talk to other vendors of mine because they were the ones who were actually addressing that issue for us. And I had to sort of do some weaving to go back to the person who put the embargo to say, can I talk to this vendor? Is it okay? And if I talk to this vendor, did you talk to them, and who in that vendor org should I talk to? Because my contact that I normally work with might not be one of the ones who's under embargo. So it really can sometimes be a tangled web, but I usually I usually go for the point where I ask for permission first, because the last thing I want to do is to break embargo. Have you guys experienced the same type of situations?
The guidance I always follow is typically an embargo starts off with two parties, the finder and whoever gets reported to. And it's kind of a relationship there. There may be, depending on what the technology is, there could be other people. Maybe it's kind of a shared architecture or a shared piece of software. So you need to have more people read in because they have a need to know, because you have more people that actually will contribute to that fix. And the guidance I always follow is I always go back to the report. I go back to the beginning. What were the established rules of this embargo? And I go back to that reporter or whoever's telling me, can I, just like you described, can I include X or Y entity or person because they will help clarify or help generate the fix, or I need to have their collaboration. And it's kind of a negotiation for them, but it's all, from my perspective, it's always the reporter kind of owns the ultimate decision of who's in and who's out, but they should be open to requests. I need help. I need to phone a friend.
Yep. So we were talking about the different types of embargoes, but then there's actually this traffic light protocol, I guess stages is what we would call them. And Katie, I think you're more aware of this than probably most of us. I usually have to look it up when I see the traffic light in the color. But can you explain that more?
Do you have problems driving around town?
Yeah. Well, I think there's more than too many colors. There's a white color too, which is traffic lights don't normally have white, right?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. So so the traffic light protocol was, I'm not sure where it actually came from. I feel like it either started at first or started in the government and then went to first. Either way, if you want to see the full what you can and can't, the easy lookup is CISA.gov/TLP. And that will take you directly to the website that goes through each one. But there are 4 designations. And the first and most widely information sharing category designation is TLP White. So TLP White means it's public information. You can share it with anybody. You can, and it's like an information sharing protocol so that you can talk to people. So it's like you would put this at the top and bottom of like an email. You would put it in the subject line. You put TLP Red and then the subject, right? So that the person knows what the information handling procedures are for that information that follows, right? So TLP White means that it can be shared with anybody. It's public information. TLP Green means it can be shared within a community. So like a community of interest kind of deal. So it can be shared within that community. So like all water plants, right? All public utilities. Maybe they have a community and you can share freely between all of those people, right? So it's a little bit more restrictive, but not overly restrictive. It's still fairly wide dissemination. TLP Red, I think, is the next one, is way more restrictive, and it means essentially you can only share it with certain parties, and those parties are kind of agreed to. And then TLP Amber is the highest designation, and that means that you can basically share that information only with the people who are on the to line. They cannot forward that message. They cannot talk about it. And it's like you can't talk about it or email about it. So either in person or digital communications outside of the people who are in that like need to know bubble. So TLP Amber is the highest level of classification. And so it's like they're not really like classifications. It's more like handling caveats. It gives people an idea of how to handle the information so that they know. Yep. What's up? No, Crob. Crob says no.
Red's the top.
Red's the top? Oh man, I missed the 2 up. So it's
I thought Amber was the top. That's interesting. But I guess
me too.
Amber, Red. I mean, come on.
My bad. Thank you for that. Thank you for that. Yeah. We'll just rewind that and we'll say it's TLP White and then TLP Green and then it's TLP Red and then it's TLP Amber. Yeah, sorry about that, guys.
Wait, are we in? No, wait, it's Red on the top?
Red's on the top.
So White's that's wrong again.
I just said the same thing again. Oh man.
So
I'm White, dyslexic and I have a problem with colors.
Little guy walking across the street. Yay, you're clear to go. Then Green, go for cars. So why don't you ask the question again and restart your statement, Katie? That Josh can edit that part out.
All right. take a breather for just a second then, if I got to cut out.
So we were just talking about the different types of embargoes, but then there's also this like different coloring system that I heard of. I think they associate it with a traffic light protocol. You know, like a traffic light, like literally stop, go. Katie, what are your thoughts on this? I think you're more familiar than most of us with this.
Yeah, so it's called traffic light protocol, and I think it resides currently with the first organization. They're the ones that own it. I don't know if they developed it or not. I can't remember honestly, but it's used really heavily within the U.S. government or government agencies. They use it a lot, especially when they're talking to partners, and you'll see it throughout. Typically, it'll be on the top and the bottom of like an email or in the subject line. So it'll say TLP and then a color code. And there are 4 designation levels. So TLP white means that it can be shared broadly with anybody. And then it goes up kind of in more restricted levels. So the idea is that the information is, it tells you how to handle that information. It's not like a classification or anything like that. What it is more like handling instructions, tells you as the person on the receiving end how to handle that, and helps the person who is trying to communicate the information so that the other person knows, I don't want you to share this information, right? So it's TLP white is the lowest level that can be shared the most broadly. Then TLP green is like that can be shared within a community. So like if you have like a utility community or something like that, there's like a community of interest for public water assets or something. It's an established group, maybe like a mailing list or something. It can be shared within that group. It's a more restrictive. It's not like publicly available. You're not going to find it by Googling it on the website, like a document or something, but it can be shared within that group. And then you go up to TLP amber. TLP amber is a little bit more restrictive. It can only be shared between certain people. And then TLP red is the highest level. And what TLP red means is that it can only be shared between the person who sends it and the person that receives it, the person on the 2 lines. So no CCs, no BCCs, no publicly available, only those people. And you really just, that's kind of the most heavily restricted. So how you'll typically see it is, like I said, you'll see it, and it's not like, especially TLP red information is like, you don't talk about it, you don't tweet about it, you don't like nothing, right? It's that, I think it specifically even says cannot be shared in like in person or electronic means, must be only those people on the 2 line can have access to that information. So that's kind of what traffic light protocol is. You see it all over. And if you want to know more about the specifics of it, you can go to CISA's website. It's easiest to find it. It's just www.cisa.gov/TLP. And it'll take you right to the definitions and the little chart.
Almost like Bitly, but better.
kind of.
It's real.
I've definitely seen my CSERT team use it with their communications, so that was clear of how widely we could share it. Because sometimes I like to share some of their findings for learning purposes, but then I have to look at the alert to know if I could even share it within my own company.
And you should always go back and ask too, because sometimes things will be TLP red when they were sent, but the disclosure has happened and nobody ever updated. It's not like it was updated, so it might have expired, and you can now talk about it publicly. So it's a snapshot in time. It's not necessarily a forever kind of deal.
Yep.
Yeah, I used to use TLP all the time communicating within the PSERT. So yeah, very, very useful tool.
So, Crow, how do you establish an embargo?
Hey, Josh, I have a secret. Can I share it with you? Will
Just
you
me.
keep it secret?
Just with
Just
me?
you and me, right? We're just 2 boys talking.
There you go.
Establishing embargo is as easy as asking and saying, I have something sensitive to share with you. Can we agree upon a place and time to share that information? And so we can figure this out further together. And then if you decide I need more help, you could say, hey, Crow, can we please invite Katie? Because Katie's the smartest person in the room. And I'm going to say, of course, Katie is. And you're going to invite Katie, and Katie's going to listen to what we have to say. And then Katie says, hey, you know what? This is really important and I can help out, but also need this amazing person, Lisa's time as well.
I need Lisa.
Because she has need to know and she has the ability to help us make the fix.
Lisa keeps
So
me out of jail.
Embargoes is, oh, she's in jail? That sucks.
No, Lisa
No,
keeps me out of jail.
I try to keep him out of jail. Yeah.
Lisa keeps
it's
me
just-
out of jail. It's the best
It's
way.
establishing embargoes as easy as saying, I have something sensitive to share with you. Can we please arrange further conversation?
And it's about communication, right? I mean, to your
Exactly.
point, it's about talking through the process so that when you make that connection, as you expand that group or as your embargo terms need to adjust, you
Mhm.
collaborate and partner together. Right?
And you have to be very sensitive to what medium you're broaching that conversation in.
Right.
Like if I'm here on a podcast saying, hey, Josh, I got this problem. Can I talk to you later? It's about flux capacitors. That's probably not the best way because this is kind of a public forum.
Right.
But if I'm using a PGP encrypted email because I have your key, super. That's really accepted on p-certs. But not everybody has that. Not everybody's awesome Linux enabled. Some people are kind of GUI clicking lamers, so they can't do PGP. So you got to use other tools potentially.
Sometimes I realize when you're working with CERT, they put an ID number to it, right? So you could say, hey, do you know about number blah, 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 blah?
And you're going to
right?
a secure portal, exactly.
Right, exactly. And then when you know that they do and you do, then usually you could talk. But I have to tell you, there's been embargo that I was with, even when you knew that the other person knew it, there was still, you really couldn't talk to each other. There was some limits there. I think that that's an old story, and I hope that it's not a future story because it wasn't fun to deal with. But I think a lot of people have learned the past few years.
I would propose the root cause of that problem is me talking to Josh, not Crob the researcher talking to Josh's company's p-certs mailbox, or me talking to Lisa's company's mailbox. It's not organization to organization. It's person to person. And that's where people change jobs, they change roles. And that's where it gets complicated and where two people might have a relationship and they talk about an embargoed issue, but maybe the reported organization, that person isn't part of the security team. They don't understand how CVD and embargoes work. So that's where it's important from us as professionals is to kind of leverage those. This is how that organization's security group wants to be communicated to.
Yeah. So you talked about when or how to establish an embargo. Yes, you did, Crow. But I don't what is the typical time established with it, Josh? How long can an embargo really last?
Well, if you're doing it the right way inside a free and open source community, it's normally 7 to 14 days.
Yeah, we're just going to ignore that you're saying that. I'm going to talk over you right now.
I say that jokingly because it depends on the community that you're working in. If you report to GPZ, there's certain rules. You report something to CertCC, there's certain rules around it. So I think it's important.
CertCC has good amount of flexible rules. Remember, we just clarified that earlier.
But they have a policy that says this is how we do stuff, and these are our guidelines. So it's important that you understand kind of what the rules of that community are because they drastically differ from open source to ICS systems to cloud to hardware to other software, legacy software. It's just different. You need to understand kind of what the rules of that and acceptance of that particular community are. Yeah, a lot of people leverage 90 days for some stupid arbitrary reason. My advice would be an issue should only be as embargoed for as long as makes sense. That a fix can get created or a mitigation can be offered to the end users, and that reporter can have whatever they need to have done. So if that takes 2 days, great. If it takes 2 years, that sucks, but potentially maybe something's that sensitive that you can't get something fixed in a shorter time frame.
There are certain circumstances that may take that long.
The answer is it depends.
It depends.
And people hate that.
Okay, I have one.
That's
I'm
the
asking
lawyer
last.
answer. How dare you give
Yeah,
the
yeah,
lawyer
exactly.
answer?
I'm gonna ask one last question, and Josh, I'm gonna pick on you because you've been sort of quiet here, not by any fault, but probably ours. When we look at embargoes, like, is there a difference between an embargo with a researcher and say an embargo with an OEM partner? I mean, do you treat them differently? Do you use the same embargo? What's sort of your scoop on that?
Absolutely, there's a difference. The biggest difference is they're different stakeholders. They have different motivations and different needs. So from that perspective, there's a difference. Otherwise, it really does boil down still to communication. Now you've just created a new dimension to the communication. Right now, we were talking about researcher to vendor communications, and now you've added an OEM, or you as a vendor might have customers that take your product and put it into other products that they then sell to their customers. And you have to create phases to your disclosure. So, but aside from the fact that the timing may change, the need to protract some of the disclosure so that you give your OEMs or your business partners time to incorporate those mitigations into their products that they're going to distribute, it really just still boils down to communication, establishing a trust bond between you, and then communicating with each other about the timing of the vulnerabilities and sharing of information.
I will say yes, that there are business relationships between a reported to organization and their business partners, but that is not necessarily germane to fixing the issue. Those external people might be interested in the problem, but they can't help fix it, so they don't fucking need to know about it until it's time.
Oh, watch your language there,
Oh my
Crow.
goodness,
We're
you're
now going to
virgin
have to
ears.
say that it's not a
Marcus
child-friendly.
is at 18 and older. So,
But it's
well,
some people might have a business interest, but they don't have the ability or need to be included, and it needs to be determined when that type of person gets told.
Yeah.
But you had another complication to this, right? Another dimension yet again, and that is, what if some of the people that you're going to disclose to need to help with the mitigation, or might be able to offer some insight into the different mitigation strategies that you're going to employ, and you need to get that information early on, right, in the cycle. So yeah.
Those people are the best.
I have to tell you, though, there's a difference. So you could still, have, I get what you're saying, Crob, is that usually the people who are going to help solve the issue you want to bring in early on. However, there can be cases where, let's say it's an OEM partner, where their customers are now your customers, and you're trying to prepare so that you can meet and not be far past what that embargo date is, and you want those OEM partners to be doing the same thing because it's your customers too. It's the same reason why that entity reached out to you in the first place.
I'll go back to my very first statement. An embargo hinges around setting expectations. So if the reported to organization has these complications, they need to state that and get that clearly that on the table. My personal opinion, and the opinion of many people from communities I've worked in, is that if you do not directly contribute to solving the issue, you do not get included until it goes public.
Yeah, so I think it hurts, right? It hurts your feelings. It hurts everyone's feelings, right? Because everyone feels special, and we're all unique snowflakes, but we're not. We're not unique snowflakes. Everyone wants to know. Everyone says they have a need to know. And the fact is that sometimes you have to make hard decisions, and some people are going to get excluded. And I hate that that's the case, but sometimes you just have to trust that you don't always know what's best for you.
I had a great analogy. I used to coach my kids' soccer game, and I was the coach. I was the only one that volunteered to be there with these 20 delightful young kids to run around in the mud. Nobody else volunteered to help, but on game day, I had a whole battery of assistant to the coaches. So again, there are people there that are contribute, can try to help solve the problem, and then there's a lot of observers. And I absolutely agree with what you had to say, Katie. That was very well said.
Yeah, when I worked in the government, overwhelmingly, the government is probably the worst. But we need to know everything. We need to know immediately, as soon as you know. And do you know? Do you know? Because I was notorious for not trying to strong arm vendors
You were.
into telling me everything. I had agreements like, look, just give me 48 hours notice. That's it. I don't need 6 months. I just need 48 hours. Just
I agree.
My statement of, if you know about a problem, but you can't do anything about it, do you help? You're helping anybody by being in the loop.
No,
I think it depends on how long you have to prepare, though, Katie, like you were saying. In some cases, that 24 hours, 48 hours, 72 hours is great. In some cases, you need more time because you as a customer are one of the ones actually helping test the code. You're helping make sure that it's viable.
Those are kinds of things that you need to work out with your OEM partners well before the time for disclosure happens. And you need to have a policy in place. Again, we talk about why a PCERT exists, because ultimately every disclosure is going to be painful. We're talking about climate, not weather, right? Every single day is going to be painful. It's going to be the worst storm on the planet, but you got to think about the long-term sort of ecosystem.
But we all love our job. It's not that painful. I mean, it's painful.
I know, but like,
we do.
But the thing is that vulnerability disclosure is inherently uncomfortable, right?
Yeah.
Because it's a compromise, and in a compromises are lose-lose situations, right? They're not everyone. If you're 80% happy, that means you're still 20% unhappy.
Well, there's a vulnerability in your code. You're always unhappy.
Correct.
I mean,
right?
you start
They're
up unhappy.
Lose situations.
lose, and is it going to get better than what you initially thought or not?
So we have to just mitigate the negative as much as possible, buy down risk as much as possible, and move on with life, right? So it's not always pleasant, it's not always fun, it's not always delightful, and everyone wants to know as early as possible. And as the vendor who was the one responsible for the product, take it seriously, try to make sure you're doing the best for your customers. And as an OEM, work out those things with your partners beforehand. Have a set policy in place, have procedures in place, have NDAs in place, have those kinds of communications lines. Communication is a two-way street. Don't expect that the tier one's going to come to you every single time. Go to them and say, like, hey man, what's up with this? And as a researcher, it's a two-way street. Like, don't expect everyone to come to catering to you all the time with a silver platter. But, as a vendor, don't expect the researcher to come to you every time as a silver platter. Like, it's a two-way street. Everyone's got to put in the effort, right? Like, and it's, as you can see, a very heated topic. There's a lot that weighs on it.
Testify.
Yeah.
So on that note, we pass it over to Josh.
No, I think you kind of summed it up really well, right? Ultimately, this is all about communication and partnership and building trust. And it is not a paved road. This is a rocky road. It's different with almost every vulnerability. There is some, I would say, some frameworks you can put in place to smooth out some of the chaos, but ultimately you're going to be making some audibles along the way. You're going to change things to adapt to the needs of the situation. And the more you communicate, the more open you're able to be, the better off it's going to end up. So with that, I want to thank you all for listening to our lively discussion on embargoes, and hopefully you have some opinions on it and that you'll share with us in the comments. Thanks, everybody. Hope you all have a wonderful rest of the week.